I'd like to welcome everybody to the class number 10 for Progress and Poverty. This is the book 9, Effects of the Remedy. And throughout this series in this course, we've been going through each of the books, book by book and chapter by chapter, hoping to enlighten the people visiting here live, but also the people watching it in an archived version. Just want to remind everybody who is watching this on the archived version that there's PowerPoint slides available on the website, the www.hgsss.org, and it'd be the way to get some clarity on matching the video that you're watching right now with the materials that are on the slides that I'm going to be describing. So my name is Marty Rowland. I'm the chair of the Education Committee for the Board of Henry George School of Social Science here at 149 East 39th Street. And Anyway, so here in Midtown Manhattan. So let's go through the slides. I got about 40, so I'll be spending a little bit of time. A lot of the materials right from the book. I'll go chapter by chapter, and you can see the materials here. Let's see. Okay, so one of the things that I found on page 464, I call it Think About This. And this is slide number 2. And once again, I pulled this from page 464 in the Progress and Poverty, book 9. There are people into whose heads it never enters to conceive of any better state of society than that which now exists, who imagine that the idea that there could be a state of society in which greed would be banished, prisons stand empty, individual interest be subordinated to general interests, and no one seek to rob or oppress his neighbor, is but a dream of impracticable dreamers for whom these practical level-headed men who pride themselves on recognizing facts as they are, have a hearty contempt. But such men, though some of whom write books, some of them occupy chairs of universities, and some of them stand in pulpits, these men do not think. This is Henry George, Progress and Poverty, page 464. So let's go to slide 3. Something that I coined, Henry George makes socialism superfluous. And I think it's funny, and this is slide 4, I think it's funny that in today's politics, which is March 2019, George may not be called a socialist, but by his standards of 1879 and what he proposes, his remedy, quote, realizes the dream of socialism. So in his way of thinking, he had socialist ideas. Ibrahima and I will agree that it would be socialism with a human face, just as Georgism is capitalism with a human face. So, slide 5. This is the science of political economy, the way that Henry George taught it. I'm just going over some preliminary slides before we get into the book 9. The 3 relationships that he talks about. Rent depends on the margin of cultivation, or you could call it the margin of production, rising as it falls and falling as it rises. And if you need to understand what the margin of production is, let me describe that. The margin of production is the best available opportunity in a given place and time for labor to employ itself and capital to produce product without the payment of rent. The level of wages available to labor at the margin of production determines the general level of wages in society. So whatever the wages you get at the margin, that's the lowest, where you don't pay rent. So the next relationship is wages. They depend on the margin of production, falling as it falls and rising as it rises. So when the margin of production is low, the wages are low, a direct relationship. Same way with interest, depending on the margin of production, falling as it falls and rising as it rises. Note its ratio, with wages being fixed by the net power of increase, which attaches to capital. This is on page 219, these three relationships. So this is what Henry George preached and what was covered several times throughout the Progress and Poverty, these three relationships. He says on page 380 that it's paradoxical that the emergence of liberty from feudal bonds, has been accompanied by a tendency in the treatment of land to a form of ownership which involves the enslavement of the working classes. So as things change, they stay more the same, essentially is what he said. So slide number 7, we got 3 or 4 slides here that goes into how the circular flow of the economy, as Henry George preached and as he educated us. If you look at the simple agricultural production without very much capital at all, you have the animal and you got the plow. Essentially, land and labor are producing a product, and you get half of it going one, half to the other, which was a typical arrangement, I suppose, unless you're in Ireland in the 1840s or 50s. Then with agricultural production with capital, you can see a mechanized use of tractors and wagons and machines. This is slide 8, where you introduce capital to the flow of the economy. And the true wages fund, which is part of the produce of the capital production process. True wages fund goes to labor, rent goes to the landowner, and this is how the economy is understood to be in agricultural production. And then you have the relationship that Henry George taught in the earlier books within Progress and Poverty, where you have pretty much the same as what I just showed for the agricultural flow, with interest going back to capital. And once again, let me describe that in Henry George's frame of reference, he treats the word interest as the return to capital. It's nothing having anything to do with bank interest, for example. It's what's the return to capital. So just want to clarify something that could confuse a lot of people reading Progress and Poverty. So in production, he's talking about adapting, which means manufacturing or transporting, and growing and exchanging. These are all what's considered production. So it's not necessarily materials coming out of a factory with raw materials in the front and automobiles on the front end. So we modify the production, the flow of wealth, the circular economy, according to Henry George, showing an option number 2. Option 2 mean what it's saying is, rather than the rent from this production process going to the landowner, it goes to infrastructure services. And this is the Henry George Theorem. that we'll go over today, but we've gone over in the first 8 books of Progress and Poverty, where infrastructure services are, he calls them the burden of government, or the public burden, he calls them. Gas, water, heat, electricity, public library, public school, public health, recreation, roads, bridges, telephone, highway, post office, telegraph, goes on and on. There's 20 examples from social problems that Henry George gets into. So that was slide 10. And of course, slide 11, where the excess economic returns goes back to the community in the way of services. So this is how Henry George describes a circular flow economy, much different than the way a Marxist would describe the flow. But in our way of thinking, it's the preferable way of describing the economy. And for those who want to have the exact citations of where this flow comes from, I got not only the citations for social problems on the slide number 12, but also from Progress and Poverty. You have all the references there. Now, one of the things that I think is important, if you take slide 12 and you take an extra copy of it and make a 3-dimensional diagram where you have one diagram in front of the other, you identify this relationship I show on slide 13, where you have the private sector economy in the front, community sector in the back. And what connects the two flows is the flow of wealth going to infrastructure. Michael Hudson describes, I think he was talking about Simon Patton, talking about how infrastructure should be a fourth factor of production over land, capital, and labor. And I think in this diagram I would agree that that's a unifying factor of being the infrastructure services that connects the private economy with the community sector. And the flows going to the public sector or the community sector is what's coming from the infrastructure. So you get the funds from rent rather than going to the landowner. It goes to the infrastructure services and goes back as capital and making the parks and the water systems and the transit and all the things that improves the economy. And just to show another diagram that I'm going to be talking to later on in this presentation, this is the circular flow of the economy as depicted in the microeconomics textbook of Heilbronner and Lester Thoreau, where you show the demand and supply curves and the circular flow, where you have the household as consumer, household as a factor of production up on top, and on the bottom you have the firm as the seller of goods and services, and the firm as an employer of factors. I call this a banal simplicity because of, for example, there's no input for banking or loans or grants or anything about the government. In fact, in this book that I cite, the government is not even identified in this flow. And this is, real quickly, is my summary of what the accepted view of the circular flow of economy as just described. The figure 1 or 7.1 organizes complexity of the marketplace in a very few simple, and I call it misleading, overall elements. And where nirvana appears when demand and supply find equilibrium. The world is divided into household and firms. That's what they're saying in these diagrams. Government is omitted unless you want to group it in with firms for some reason. Heilbronner and Thoreau make no provision for the identification or the capture of the rents that would move society toward a just distribution of wealth. So that's the key idea here, is that the economics as it's taught currently makes no provision for the just distribution of wealth, as Henry George did in Progress and Poverty. And I'll be getting into that as Book 9 describes it. Essentially, the authors are okay with social inequality and do their hardest to apologize that the world is as just as it needs to be. A proverbial unjust equilibrium where you have slaves and slave masters, kings of speculation, and homeless, unemployed, or underpaid workers. So today's class, what we're going to do is begin on slide 16 and page 434, where Henry George says, to abolish the taxation which, acting and reacting, now hampers every wheel of exchange and presses upon every form of industry would be like removing an immense weight from a powerful spring. So abolishing that taxation relieves that immense weight, is what he's getting at. So that's how we're going to begin. I have a statement at the end that I'll summarize. So Progress and Poverty, class number 10, book 9, Effects of the Remedy. Got 4 chapters. I'm going to go chapter by chapter. And just to let you know that we're going to have a class 10, we're going to have a class 11 that goes through the first half of the last book in Progress and Poverty, which is book 10. And then we're going to summarize it with the second half of book 10 and a conclusion of this course that began in the fall of 2018 and ending here in the spring of 2019. So book 9, chapter 1, of the effect upon the production of wealth. Community gains by refusing to kill the goose that lays golden eggs. This is page 435, slide 19. And one of the benefits of watching this archive video and attending these classes is you get a lot of the analogies that Henry George uses that you might want to use in your day-to-day teaching or conversation. The next one is kind of interesting, comes out of the Bible. Refraining from muzzling the ox that treadeth out the corn. And the interpretation of this is allowing the ox to eat from part of his labor while he treads out the grain. He's given an example of how labor needs to benefit from the labor that they're giving out rather than everything that they're producing going to rent, is the point that Henry George is making. Every productive enterprise, besides its return to those who undertake it, yields collateral advantages. Another term that Henry George uses. Yields collateral advantages to others. This is page 435, slide 19. And I see this as the first person to identify what's now called positive externalities. But according to George, these advantages were not outside of his circular flow. So even though there's a term called positive externalities, that's within a circular flow where all the factors are not representative. So Henry George was way ahead of his time and was truthful, even though the later science of economics went astray. Another interesting statement, a fruit tree. Rain which it helps to attract falls not alone on his field. This is slide 20, page 435. I see this as an example of Henry George being an early ecologist, somebody who could recognize climate effects on forestation. I don't know of anybody going back 140 years who would make a statement like this. But that's what he said. Production benefits others besides those who get the direct profits. Nature laughs at a miser, page 436. And this is where I said that the statement exposes the banal simplicity of the Heilbronner thorough circular economic flow. where you had those households and firms, and they had a supply and demand. There's nothing in that circular flow that talks about others benefiting as a side benefit. And then with George's remedy, the selling price of land would fall, land speculation would receive its death blow, land monopolization would no longer pay. And I'll get into a little bit more of the details, because this is a point that Henry George makes throughout the Progress and Poverty. And once again, I show the Heilbronner and Thoreau circular flow for your ease of finding it. So now we're on slide 22. And so Henry George says on page 437, placing all taxes on the value of land is like putting up the land at auction to whomsoever would pay the highest rent to the state. Demand for land fixes its value. And this is very similar to Steve Taft in his book on true free trade, where he talks about an auction system for implementing a George's solution. Speculators would be taxed as much as though his land were covered with houses and barns. They would pay for the privilege of keeping other people off of it. And in a previous class, I talked about a building that's on the corner of 3rd Avenue and East 38th. And we did a little bit of research on the value of that. Essentially, it's $250,000 a year to keep the building vacant and empty. So it's a good investment for somebody. Payments to the state would be made in lieu of all taxes now levied upon improvements, machinery, and stock, page 438. So on page or slide 23, we come to page 438 in the Progress and Poverty. Employers of labor not only compete against other employers, but against the ability of laborers to become their own employers. So this is the argument that Henry George brings up quite often, is that when you relieve the theft of wages from the laborer, which goes to the landowner, you're keeping the laborer from possibly getting into a entrepreneurial opportunity where he becomes the employer. The recurring paroxysm which paralyzed industry would cease with the remedy implemented. And that was a main point in book 5. You might go back and look at that. On page 439, this is something that Henry George mentions. So let's go now to chapter 2. This is chapter 2 out of 4 in the book. Oops. Yeah, there we go. Chapter 2, of the effect upon distribution and thence upon production. Slide 24. Now we're on slide 25. George calls infrastructure asset services public burdens. The advantages of a land tax cannot be fully appreciated until we consider the effect on the distribution of wealth. Public burdens, we've talked about that on that circular flow diagram of Henry George, where you have water supply and gardens and parks and transit and public health, things of that sort. Public ownership of land allows wealth to be transferred from labor and capital to private hands. So that's the problem that Henry George is trying to avoid, and he makes that point on page 440. Destroy this inequality by taking the whole of rent to promote equality, page 440. So on page slide 26, we get this statement on page 441. Wealth then would be divided into two portions. in wages and interests, which is the labor and capital, then to the community as a whole, distributed in public benefits to all its members. So once again, we see the diverse crowd that we describe as the common pool that benefiting from the economy as Henry George lays it out. Also in chapter 2, page 441, we're on slide 27. The one part is the result of individual effort, and the other is the increased power with which the community as a whole aids the individual. So when the wealth goes to the community, as I just described, the wealth going to the community aids the individual in care and compassion, people who can't help themselves, the invalid, the sick, the homeless. In so doing, private ownership in land is abolished. So when you achieve the Henry George theorem, which talks about taxation of all the land, we abolish the private ownership. Slide 28, chapter 2 again. We're on page 442 now. Labor and capital gain by the positive decline in rent, by the decrease in speculative land values. A new equilibrium is established with rates of wages and interest much higher. So we're always going back to that relationship that I pointed out at the beginning, which is Henry George's science of political economy. The enormous advantages of a dense population would be united with freedom and equality, which Henry George says only found occasionally. There are losses to society when poverty is high. In 1879, Henry George points out that England maintained over 1 million paupers on official charity, and New York City spent 7 million a year in a similar way. So if somebody wanted to do a trend line showing how much New York spends on, I don't know, the word would be paupers, but New York City does spend money, especially for homeless, which might be the current term for a pauper. So also on chapter 2, we're on slide 29. Efficiency of labor increases with higher wages. With higher wages, you get self-respect, intelligence, hope, and energy. So it's more than just getting more money. You improve society and the benefits of living together. This is on page 444. The next one is, man is not a machine, nor is he an animal, where powers reach thus far and no further. Who can say what infinite powers of wealth-producing capacity of labor may be raised in the method that he's describing on page 444? It is so unnatural and absurd, the spectacle of men who have only a few years to live, slaving away their time for the sake of dying rich. Page 446, something you could quote to your miserly friend, whoever they might be. So now we go to chapter 3 of the effect upon individuals and classes. And on slide 31, we have page 447 in Progress and Poverty. Landowners not only have no claim to compensation for the remedy that Henry George lays out, they will not really be injured. So not only shouldn't be claiming compensation, they're not going to be injured by the taxation of the whole of rent on land. It is true that the value of lots will diminish or disappear. However, he retains the same security of always having a lot that he had before, page 448. And then he makes this interesting analogy with a pair of boots. page 448. Take a man who bought some boots. Is he a loser when the price of boots falls? Comparing boots to land, which is kind of an interesting analogy. Taxation today, as it did in 1879, falls on that landowner with peculiar severity: houses, barns, fences, crops, and stock. But as in the city where land values are high and where the weight of the land tax would be felt, agricultural areas would be lightly touched. This is an interesting point that was highlighted in the book on the history of the single tax by a guy named Young, written in 1916, where he describes the period of time between 1900 and 1920, where the Joseph Fels organization spent money for people to go out into the hinterlands, and this one group ended up in Missouri preaching the Henry George gospel to a bunch of farmers who had been prior informed by people who are against Henry George that these Georges were out here just to steal their money and their land, that they're going to let the people in the city off without paying anything. And it's an interesting story, and I have no reason to doubt it, but it took the sheriff to keep the Georges from being strung up and hung from a tree. Interesting story. It would bring down great fortunes, but would impoverish no one. It was page 452. On slide 33, chapter 3, we have a quote here on page 453. Wealth would be distributed with the degree in which the industry, skill, knowledge, or prudence of each contributed to the common stock. Pay attention to that word common stock. That's what I use in that circular flow diagram. Use the exact words of Henry George. The non-producer would no longer roll in luxury while the producer got the bare necessities. Page 453. National debts would not long survive the abolition of the system from which they spring. Page 453. So he gets into the national economy and predicts that with such a system, we'd have fewer national debts because we'd be taking care of the goose that lays the golden eggs, the way he describes it. How many men are there who fairly earn $1 million? So 1879, he's describing, does anybody fairly earn $1 million? And I'm wondering if that can still be said today, even though the conversion would probably be more like a billion. But on page 453, he makes that comparison. So the last chapter we get in on book number 9 is of the changes that would be wrought in social organization and social life. There would be a saving of strain in the courts. Much of their business concerns disputes over land ownership. This would cease to be the state as the state becomes the sole owner of land and occupiers rent-paying tenants. Page 454, slide 35. So this is the interesting statement here, page 455. Get rid of judges, bailiffs, clerks, prison keepers, and the great host of lawyers whose talents are wasted. Let them turn to higher pursuits. So if you're out of good lawyer jokes, you can go to page 455, Progress and Poverty, and talk about how Henry George says that lawyers should stop wasting the time and get a better paying job. With the remedy, we realize the dream of socialism, not through government repression. So page 456, this is where Henry George answers it by himself, whether or not he's a socialist, it's hard to say because he doesn't really claim it, but he says, with his remedy, we realize the dream of socialism. And that's why when I say that Henry George makes socialism superfluous, that means the same thing. So chapter 4, we're on slide 36, getting close to the end. When I had that circular flow diagram, I showed the types of infrastructure as identified in social problems. If you go to book 9, chapter 4, we have a similar list. I think we got a few extras here. But George identifies public baths. I don't think that was in that original list. Museums, libraries, gardens, lecture rooms, music and dancing halls, theaters, universities, technical schools, shooting galleries, playgrounds, gymnasiums, heat, light, motive power, railroads, gasworks, water, roads lined with fruit trees. Discoverers and inventors rewarded, scientific investigations supported, all for the public benefit. That's on page 456 if you're looking for specific types of infrastructure that Henry George was promoting that should, what he also called the public burdens. So Henry George is not necessarily talking about smaller government, but he's talking about effective government and providing those goods that people use and need and entrepreneurs need to make their businesses as good as it can be. Government would administer a great cooperative society. So another socialist sounding type word, cooperative society. That was on page 456. So society tells us nonstop, 24/7, get money, honestly if you can, but at any rate, get money. So on slide 37, he goes on, continues, a wealthy man is admired, and this is one of the conflicting ideas that Henry George has. A wealthy man is admired, but it is not in the guise of a hideous monster that Satan tempts the children of men, but as an angel of light. And he's comparing Satan to the people who have a lot of wealth that they throw around. So I thought it might be useful to consider the debates that are going on currently about African charity. For example, Bill Gates has had a ongoing conflict with an economist named Dambisa Moyo, where he was saying, I'd like to give my African charity, but Professor Moyo says there's a pressing need for national development that charity forestalls. So this is the consideration that Henry George gets to about what a wealthy man might be admired doing, kind of like Bill Gates. But Henry George says, you know, sometimes wealthy people might be acting as Satan. Give labor a free field and its full earnings. Take for the benefit of the whole community that fund which the growth of the community creates, and want and the fear of want would be gone. So give labor its full earnings. Short-sighted is a philosophy which counts on selfishness as the master motive of human action, page 462. And my comment was, so much for Adam Smith's invisible hand. Slide 38, we're getting near the end, still chapter 4. On pages 462 and 463, Henry George says, self-interest is a mechanical force. Human nature is a chemical, self-interest is a mechanical force. I think that's what I said. Human nature is a chemical force which melts and fuses and overwhelms. Nothing seems impossible. Heroes and saints are never selfish. Human nature is the electricity of the moral universe. Another statement that should be on a t-shirt. And I think that might be my next one. Human nature is the electricity of the moral universe, page 462 and 3. We are made for cooperation, like feet. There's 2 feet. We got 2 hands. We got 2 eyelids. Like the rows of the upper and lower teeth. This is cooperation, page 463. Banish want and fear of want, and men become simply idlers. This is the argument that people on the conservative spectrum might say. But that's the old slave owner's argument, that men can be driven to labor only with a lash. Nothing is more untrue, which is Henry George's statement on 466. And then slide 39, man is the constructive animal. He builds and improves, page 466. To assume the cooperative form, the more equal diffusion of wealth would unite capitalist and labor in the same person. This is the point that Henry George makes again and again and again, is that once you free up capital and labor from getting their wages and interest stolen through the rent that's typically absconded by the landowner, you provide that opportunity for the laborer to become the capitalist and an entrepreneur. Work would become a lightstone. Work would become a lightsome thing, less monotony, shorter hours, more intellectual occupations, less productive forces going to waste. Seems to remind me of the idea of a universal basic income. If we have robots doing all of our work, creating all this wealth, perhaps we'd have a lot more time to read the books that we always wanted to read, become more intellectual. Henry George talks about this on page 468 in Progress and Poverty. So to end the class on book 9, I might go over a few items at the end of the class just as a little bonus, because I think we got a little extra time, and we'll take some questions from the audience. So we're going to end the class on the book 9 on what he said on page 471, this slide 40. I have now traced to their source social weakness and disease. I have shown the remedy. I have covered every point and made every objection. But the problems that we have been considering, great as they are, pass into problems greater yet, into the grandest problems with which the human mind can grapple. I am about to ask the reader, which is going into book 10, who has gone with me so far, to go with me further into still higher fields. So it's kind of like a little teaser so that you'd read book 10. But I ask him to remember that in the little space which remains of the limits to which this book must be confined, I cannot fully treat the questions that arise. So that was book 9, Progress and Poverty. What I want to do as a little teaser, because we got a little bit of time, is talk about the slides at the end. And there's a standard practice that I'm writing with the organization called ASTM. And the standard practice is on infrastructure management. And in the practice, it would be a procedure that a mayor or a governor or a university president or a military base commander or a private company CEO might take to manage the infrastructure assets that they have and be in communication with the people who receive the infrastructure services. So it's a matter of collaboration, democratizing the creation, maintenance, and the goods that are created with infrastructure. So in the practice itself, I have these diagrams I'm going to show over the next 5 or 10 minutes. And I'm going to describe how revenues and outlays are laid out so you can have a clear mental picture. It's something that I've always thought was needed in a course on economics, is simplify things to where you can put basic information on a 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper and say, okay, I get it. So I also used materials from writers that are associated with the cameralist tradition of continental Europe, which are quoted freely in the Reinert father and Erich Reinert and son Sophus Reinert. They identify with the cameralist tradition. So that's where I came up with the idea for the revenues, and the next slide was the outlays, with the idea that you have in revenues you got what's immediate and then immediate. The idea that in older times the immediate revenue was the personal funds of the rich person in the community, who was always looked at to fund maybe a water system, maybe repair the wall around the community, maybe to fund the war effort. But so that's what the B is, the immediate revenue, and A would be whatever the townspeople do to fund the current services. In outlays, you have a similar relationship where Y is spending those, or Y is the extraordinary fund. So you get it from the wealthy people, and it goes to the outlays for doing what is needed to be done. So if you divide up those, the revenue portion, which was identified as the A and the B, you divide the A into 3 components, because now we're going to get into the separation of capital projects and the banking sector, the investment sector, where you have relationships on both sides of the revenues and outlays. So to replace the A, you have E, which is the non-private source of revenue. But what's most important is the C and the D, which are going to relate to a similar factor on the outlays, which I'll show here. And we have W and Z, and I'll show the relationship when we put them side by side. So what we show here on this diagram here is revenues and outlays, one sheet of paper showing the full economy, and it won't be obvious how this relates until we go here, where you have revenues. E could be land value capture, it could be the parking meter tolls and the revenues generated that way. B, that could be personal property taxes. The size of the pie slices is what I would identify as favorable to a Georgist solution, where the personal or the private sources of money are small, with the B, and the E being a larger portion of revenues. And I wanted to show it that way because I am a Georgist and I have an opportunity to present it any way I want. So what we're showing now is E plus B should be greater than X. Now, the importance of that relationship is such that you're not borrowing any money to do the current services. So I think everybody would agree that it would be crazy to borrow money to pick up garbage with the sanitation department and ship it to Ohio, where some of our waste goes to. What I understand is our garbage from New York City goes to Ohio, Pennsylvania, Virginia, North Carolina, a lot of different places. So it wouldn't make any sense to borrow money, because we can get money from land value capture, we can charge people for congestion pricing, for example, ways of generating money. So that would be how you pay for current services. Now, this is probably the most important slide in this little extra that I'm showing here, is the flow of capital project money, where W is the money that you bring in through grants and credit, bonds, going out for loans. So it'd be outlaid because you're getting the money, and then you're outlaying over to C, which is in the revenue side, so that you get the money, you identify the firms that are going to be designing and building the infrastructure, whether it's a subway or Hudson Yards or whatever other type of development you have. And then going to the D is where you might have a toll on a toll bridge, or it might be a direct benefit where you're getting a land value capture directly from the project. And then from D, that's the revenue being generated from the project, going over to Z, which is retiring any outlays or bonds or debts or credits. Now, with the capital spending, you might also get the E and the B, even though E and B are contributing to the normal operation. You might have an excess of land value capture, and maybe you might need a little bit extra to retire the bonds. I also, in the standard, I have a relationship where C is no more than 1.25 times Z. So you're not paying an exorbitant interest payment, a bank interest payment, to retire the debt. So the importance of the diagrams that I just described is when implemented, a city would demonstrate for each of their infrastructure how their money is generated, how it's spent, the relationship between the C and the Z, and assuring that money is never borrowed for current services, kind of like the way Greece did, Puerto Rico did, Detroit during their financial hardship. And that was the slides from the class number 10 tonight. I'd like to open it up for any questions, and if you have questions and you're watching this in the archived mode, send your questions to the Henry George School of Social Science. You can find the phone numbers and the contact information on www.hgsss.org. My name is Marty Rowland. I'll ask if there's any questions from the audience today. I hear none, so I thank you for watching. It was a pleasure to present class number 10. Look for class number 11 sometime in, I think we're going to do it probably in April, because we've got a special seminar on March 26th, so that's going to be a little conflict if you're looking at the website. Once again, my name is Marty Rowland.